everybody, and welcome to the latest episode of Let's Talk Astrology. Today, we are delighted to introduce astrologer and psychologist Frida Richtfist. So thank you so much for joining us today, and how are you doing?
Hi, thank you so much. I'm doing good. Feeling the eclipse energies.
Oh, I'm with you. I'm with you. With Mercury retrograde as well and all the things going on. Absolutely. So in today's episode, we're going to be talking about what we've got up here is empowering the client, and also talking about how to bring up sensitive issues when delineating the chart for clients in really in an ethical and compassionate manner. And this is what we're going to talk about today. So yeah, thank you for sharing this presentation.
Yes, I will swiftly move on from here. Well, I'm Frida Richtfist, as you mentioned, and I'm an astrologer and former clinical psychologist. I'm also actually a PhD student, so I'm halfway through my PhD studies.
Oh, wonderful, wonderful.
Yeah,
congratulations.
right.
I hope it goes well.
Thank you. So let's see. Yeah, today's workshop, we're going to go briefly through the importance of ethics in astrology, because this is something that I brought with me from my psychological practice when I used to work as a clinical psychologist. I'm very, very much about ethical approaches to astrology, so I'm going to bring in a little bit of that in today's presentation. Mm-hmm. Then I'm also going to showcase a little bit how to apply, I would say, modern evidence-based psychological techniques to astrology. And this is because, I call myself an astrologer with 1 foot in science and 1 foot beyond, because I am a PhD student. I'm come from the clinical side. I've been in academia for a very long time. And for me, it's quite interesting how to take something more esoteric like astrology and apply modern psychological methods onto astrology, because that also, then we can move past this whole debate about astrology not being valuable because it's not scientific, blah blah blah. I'm so tired of those conversations.
Exactly. I'm waiting for the day when the two are married again, because of course, astrology and the sciences were married many centuries ago. But again, if we can get back away from that divorce and back to marriage, I think that would be fantastic.
Yeah, and we can do that in so many different ways, and that's also why I want to bring this together today, to fuse them, because as you can understand, I have spent a lot of years in academia and working in the clinical psychology field, and I many times had people ask me, oh, but why are you into astrology? Why can you not do something scientific? And I've had this stigma around my whole practice. So I just, got rid of that, you can say, in 2019, because I've been into astrology since 2011. So quite a lot of years I was under the surface here. So I've let go of that stigma. And this is basically my approach to how to merge these two subjects.
Wonderful, wonderful.
So yeah, we will also talk about how to empower the clients, as you mentioned, and I have 3 chart examples. So let's start also with some questions, because these are the questions that I wrote to your colleague Lori when I was suggesting this webinar. And one of the questions is, how can we approach the experiences of the client and validate their experiences while creating acceptance, room for growth, and increased agency? And the second question is, how can we talk about the experiences that we identify in the birth chart without blaming parents or shaming the native? I think these are really, really important questions. And I think, in particular in the kind of astrological lane that I'm in, I'm really, really passionate about these questions, because to me, astrology is more than fortune telling. It's more than saying this is what's going to happen or this is what you should be doing. No, it's really like a great tool for, to understand more about our place in the cosmos and understanding, how everything works in alignment, the outer world with the inner world and vice versa, And
I love that approach, as you're saying here, with acceptance and growth, and that really it is just a weather report. So when we're talking about what's coming up, moving away from that deterministic, some of that ancient text where it's like, this is going to happen or this is going to happen, and moving, as you're saying in this whole overview of this talk, is empowering the client to make decisions for themselves and not relying on the astrologer for the answers, and again, just to empower them to make their decisions in how they go along.
Yeah, and as I want to be clear just quickly that I'm not against the traditional, more, I say, a little bit more rigid approaches in astrology. I'm totally not against it, because, for example, horary astrology, we need it, right? When we do elections, we can need it. Like, is it a good time or is it a bad time? There's no in between sometimes. But, when it comes to birth charts and the developmental aspect here and the client owning their own life and creating meaning out of what we can see in a horoscope, I think it's very, very important to talk about flexibility and, you know, growth and these kind of themes. And here's where the ethic comes in, right? This is what we're discussing, the ethics.
Mm-hmm.
And I just wanted to briefly say, like, because based on my background as a clinical psychologist, you know, we have so many guidelines there as therapists, what we have to do, what we cannot do, how we should approach certain themes. And as astrologers, we also work in these close, intimate relationships, right? We sit with a lot of people who are potentially quite vulnerable. So they come to us to seek some sort of guidance, and we need to be aware that there's always like a power dynamic going on between the astrologer and the client. I mean, I feel this myself when I go to an astrologer, even though I am an astrologer. I call myself an astrologer. Whenever I go to see an astrologer, a medium, even a therapist, you know, I'm thinking like, oh, what is this person going to tell me about me? You know, immediately we have that power dynamic there evident. So it's so important for the astrologers to discuss this and really like acknowledge this, because that's how we can also try to minimize the potentially harming effects of that.
And of course, that's the key word is do no harm. And again, the ethical considerations, because our words are powerful as astrologers, or astrologers you might go and see yourself. That again, because astrology is not in the world that you come from, is not a regulated area. So again, those ethical guidelines you have to bring in to astrology, that people aren't going out there willy-nilly and just saying things off the cuff without really taking in consideration, again, the power of their words and the effect, as you said, it can have on the client. Absolutely.
Yeah, because as I say here, personally, I am still recovering from a lot of these things that I've been told in the past. You know, just recently I went to an astrologer with great experience, and I was told things that, you know, could potentially be quite damaging to me. Absolutely. When it comes to, you know, sensitive subjects, which are pregnancies, right? Deaths. We have marriage. Is this the right partner for you? Like those kind of life-changing subjects. I think as astrologers, there's a very fine line here between showing that you are skillful, that you have the confidence, that you know how to read a horoscope and deliver that, versus, you know, opening up the themes. Okay, if you see like something, for example, with the moon, instead of saying the relationship with your mother was not good, you can say, oh, I see a theme here of mothering. How do you relate to mothering? You know what I mean?
Those open-ended questions, and again, that walking away from that deterministic. Because I have a client who went to an astrologer many moons ago who turned around and said to her that she'd never have children, and that is just absolutely horrendous. And again, that deterministic way of approaching it. But again, empowering the client and asking the questions where, as you said, themes may come up, whether it's certain, you know, malefics with the light, whatever that might be. But again, avoiding that deterministic viewpoint and verbalizing that. Yeah.
Yeah, super important. I just say it because I'm a trained psychologist, former clinical psychologist, and and I get affected by it. Imagine then what people who are in a more vulnerable state could, I mean, potentially feel from these kind of encounters that are not totally ethical. I'm very much about bringing this up.
And usually when a client comes to you, they've got a topic on mind. You know, sometimes you might just have general consultations about, you know, tell me about the natal chart, whatever it might be, but it's usually they've got something on their mind they're wanting to address, and it might be a crisis that's coming up in their life. So again, that's such an important point. Absolutely.
Yeah, and I like to look at International Association of Ethics in Astrology, and they have a really good site with 15 guidelines that people can look at if they're interested. And what I've chosen to do in my practice, for example, and what I'm also applying today at, you know, when I'm going to do the chart work, is these guidelines that I pick out, because I think it's so extremely important that we look at astrology also, and of course do no harm, respect the agency and autonomy, like it says here, and the confidentiality, because we do get to hear a lot of things that are potentially very sensitive, right? About people's life stories, right?
Yeah.
And here is also important, number 7, because this is also where I connect and I see a parallel to my former work as a clinical psychologist, because, you know, using other people's birth data without express permission, this is, for me, not Good. Because the way I see a horoscope, I see that as a journal, like I used to handle psychiatric journals when I worked as a clinical psychologist, and it's very, regulated there, because as soon as you open the journal, it will be tracked in the system. You can see exactly who's been there looking at things. So it's, for me, when I open up a horoscope, I get the same feeling, because I'm like, whoa, okay, it's a lot of information just flooding through here. I can see stuff about the childhood. We can see stuff about the most intimate aspects of the human. So it's so important to handle the horoscopes with care. Not to be superstitious, but just handle it with care. That's my approach.
I mean, it's almost opening somebody else's soul if they're giving you that data. And again, certainly not using anybody else's data without, again, expressed permission, as you've put there. That's why when we're doing, with students, or we're delineating charts, using people in the public square, famous people, just to delineate charts and to go through, but certainly a no-no for using people's data without their express permission. Absolutely.
Yeah, it's so important. And number 8, I also want to just briefly touch on this, because, language. Use the language that neither creates false hopes nor speaks in absolutes. This is also super important, because we tend to forget this as well as astrologers, that we communicate, right? Astrology is a language, but then we have to take that language and translate it into something, we make sense through our words. And I'm going to showcase this also in the end with the charts I'm going to pull up. But, for example, a planetary energy like Pluto. I like to take that as an example. In pop cult astrology, Pluto is often seen, as scary, just like Saturn. And in my opinion, it's so important how we phrase, the energy of that planetary body. For example, with Pluto, like I said, you can see that as trauma, right? You can see Pluto as very difficult to some extent, but we can also use words that are a little bit less, how can I say, loaded, or you understand what I mean? Like a little bit more neutral in a sense, because that creates more room for the client to also develop from there. And I like to use, the word intensity with Pluto, because you can say then, if you see, for example, the moon in relationship to Pluto, let's say, oh, but it looks like, the emotional life could be painted with some intensity here. Not to say that your emotional life is traumatic, because then when we use more neutral words that still show the meaning of the planetary energy, then I think we also adjust for the power imbalance. We invite the client to the conversation, and we let the client also from their phrase how this manifests for them. I think it's really important, because the words we use, ultimately they are what creates the narrative, and the narrative is what creates the meaning in people's lives, which is impacted and impacts their own agency over their life. So it's super important to think about the words that we use when we read a chart, and when we involve the client in this dialogue, as a consultation should be, according to me.
Yeah, I love that definition you put there. So the fine line between, not giving the false hope or the wishful thinking astrology, and certainly not the absolute. So you take Pluto, for example, okay, a generational planet, but as you know, if it's, say, transiting one of the angles, the ascendant, IC, whatever that might be, or one of the lights, particularly the moon or the sun, again, addressing that language in a way that it's not going to be, oh, you're coming up for some trauma coming up, you better get prepared, using that language skillfully to maybe address an issue that may come up, but again, involving the client and that dialogue and using that language. But that's, I think it's such an excellent point that you're making.
Yeah, it's I'm going through a Pluto transit right now myself. I'm having Pluto squaring my sun, and I call it my purification process.
I like that purification process. Yeah,
it's not a traumatic dark experience. It's a purification process for me, and a lot of things can be included in that phrase. But yeah, and lastly, also, knowing your limits. I think this is super important also. That's why I chose these guidelines, because the limits, also from my point of view as a former clinical psychologist, if I have people coming to me and they want to know, how do I cure my cancer through my horoscope, I'm going to kindly refer them somewhere else. And this is what I choose to do in my practice, just because, it's a little bit sensitive still. I'm a former clinical psychologist. I'm a PhD student in psychology, in research and science, and I'm doing astrology, you know, the esoteric, the intuitive stuff. So I have to really balance my roles, and that's why I try to be clear on this. You know, to me, you come for astrological guidance. If you want other advice, you maybe have to seek medical assistance or something else. You know, it's so important. Or like I say, I don't predict pregnancy. That's also a good example.
Right.
Know the limits.
Absolutely.
So let's move on then, because that was the ethics. I have that as like a bottom on this pillar, you know. I think it's so important with the ethics. And in the middle, we have astrology. And then what I'm adding on to this whole framework is positive psychology and ACT, acceptance and commitment therapy. I'm using techniques from that particular therapeutic method. So I'm just going to briefly go into that because a lot of people know about traditional psychology, and that's also what I've been, you know, what I used to work with as a clinical psychologist in the psychiatric, adult care. There we were more focused on, you know, the causes and the symptoms of mental illnesses and emotional disturbances, and also like to decrease dysfunction. We had that kind of perspective, right? To go from okay, -8 to -2. How do we decrease this person's anxiety? While when we work with positive psychology, then we're more in a, you know, focus of how to enhance well-being, how to enhance somebody who's already functioning, or how to, you know, grow what is working. And here we emphasize also traits, thoughts, patterns, behaviors, and experience that are forward-looking and that can help to improve the quality of a person's day-to-day life. It's such a great distinction because, like I say, it's sensitive to be a therapist and an astrologer. So I have to be very clear on that. The positive psychology is what I apply. So I'm not here trying to, you know, decrease anxiety, but that might be a side effect of working in a positive psychological paradigm. But that's not my main goal. My main goal with my practice is to like boost what is good and have this forward-looking empowerment perspective.
Wonderful. And the numbers there, would you like to explain what those numbers do?
Yeah, sorry.
Yep.
Let's go back. Yeah, I just mean basically that if we have a decrease, like a focus of dysfunction, I would say, then somebody might be suffering like from anxiety and, you know, depression. That person is on a scale, on a -8, you know what I mean? And wants to go from a -8, like a bad, like severe, difficult state to like a less difficult state. Yeah, that's what we do in the psychiatry, right? Because many people that come to the psychiatry, they are already quite strained, you know, they are strained with a lot of emotional and psychological difficulties.
Right.
So you have to kind of work from that angle, whether the positive psychology and going from +2 to +8 is more of how to say, health enhancing, or like a lot of people also talk about how to prevent, or you understand what I mean? Like, yeah, just boost health.
that self-esteem, all those well-being. Yeah, wonderful.
This is also what my research is about in my PhD studies. I'm researching how to do this in a school environment, like these kind of positive psychology, implementations to boost the students' well-being.
Wonderful.
Yeah. So let's just briefly also talk about what ACT is, because ACT is just a cognitive behavioral therapy method where we try to increase psychological flexibility. And it's basically that, you know, a person that has psychological flexibility is a little bit, I would say, better equipped to some point to handle life, because it's really about, you know, use acceptance, use different mindfulness processes and commitment, and, you know, adjust to whatever life brings you, because we know that life is not static, right? So we know that having a flexibility and adjust to situational demands is very, very important for well-being. And I'm going to show how this applies to the chart, because this also goes a little bit in line with what we talked about, you know, rigid versus flexible or agile approaches to astrology. It's like the same thing, only that this is like in life in general, and we were talking about astrology. So yeah, but acceptance and commitment practices. And like I said, The biggest thing in that method is the psychological flexibility. And we break it down to attention to the present moment, values, committed action. We have self as context, diffusion, acceptance. And I've written a little shorts here about what the different components mean, because these are, according to Stephen Hayes, like what makes up the psychological flexibility. For example, be in the moment, because the brain likes to go to the future and go backwards, worry about the future, be depressed.
I do myself. I'm either ruminating about the past or thinking about the future. Trying to be mindful and in the present is, for me at least, quite difficult at times.
That happens a lot. And, also diffusion, for example, it says here, observe the process of thinking without getting fixated on them to the point of significant distress, which means that as humans, sometimes we have to learn that we are not the thoughts. We have the thoughts, It's basically like starting to, with the self as context, also starting to observe, okay, what are my thoughts? Okay, how do I relate to my thoughts? Can I also create a little bit of, how can I say, space between me and my thoughts? And perhaps I cannot stop my thoughts from coming, but I can let my thoughts, wander. I can choose what to focus on, how I direct my attention. And that's also, committed action. And yeah, like I say, this is what makes up the psychological flexibility. Is there anything in this little Hexaflex that you think is unclear before I move forward to the chart examples? Because this is quite an important point.
No, it's very, very, very interesting. Does it have any relation to CBT, so cognitive behavioral therapy,
Yes.
and those kind of, yeah.
Yes, because this psychological flexibility, which is like I would say the central focal point in acceptance and commitment therapy. Acceptance and commitment therapy is a third wave CBT method. So it comes from that branch of cognitive behavioral therapy. And why I like to bring this in also is because traditionally, when I have read about astrology pairing up with psychology, and correct me if I'm wrong, but many times I have seen, okay, astrology and Jungian psychology, Carl Jung, for example. And that is a little bit more of a, I would say, it's more in the Freudian category, right? It's not really about cognitive behavioral therapy. And the thing is that the Jungian psychology, in that sense, in today's society, where psychological research is, so much about, okay, it has to be effective, it has to be evidence-based, it has to work. The CBT methods, they are evidence-based, while other methods are not. So this means that as a practicing psychologist or therapist, we cannot work with methods that are not scientifically proven to work. Because, for example, in Sweden, and I know it's the same in America when I spoke to your colleague Lori, because, for example, if people come and seek therapeutic help and they are funded by the government or their insurance, the insurance company or the government, they need to know that this is going to work, right? So that's why a psychologist and therapists are a bit limited in what kind of methods they can offer if they want to be evidence-based. But yeah, we're going to start looking at some chart examples. And just before that, I wanted to say that I am a modern intuitive astrologer. So this actually means that I combine my logic with intuition when I sit with clients. Because, as you know, I am an academic, so I'm a lot about the logic, but, I love to connect the two. And I think it also creates synergy when we allow the intuitive perspective to also come forth in the astrological consultation.
Wonderful.
And I see all planetary energies as just energies, basically. So for me, there's not really anything that we can say is good or bad in that sense, because I also think about energy and that energy can be transformed. So that's why we can look at one planetary energy and we can see it from so many different angles if we use our flexibility, and we can see how we can transform that through committed action, our values, and what we choose to do, right? Our agency in life to create meaning, create our own narrative. And the house system I use is Placidus, and I usually work with the 10-degree orb. Yeah, I strive to enrich.
So is that 10 degrees for all the inner planets, outer planets? How do you work there?
Yeah, of course, when I think about outer planets, okay, I'm gonna say it like this. This is how I come up with my mind. When it comes to aspects and orbs, at the end of the day, it's just like house systems, right? It's something that we have also decided, right? Okay, but this is these are the limits, like. And what I say is that, for example, if we have a conjunction, okay, two people are, imagine two humans standing like this, and they are feeling the attraction, and they're like, okay, like this. When does it start to, how can I say, tingle? When does it start? When is it 2 millimeters?
Applying 2 or 3
Is it 5?
degrees or 5 or 10? Yeah.
So that's the way I see it. Of course, if it's like 0, 0, 0, 0 orb, yeah, then it's a kiss, right?
Yeah.
But if I see like I don't know, 2 degrees, I'm like, okay, but I think this is strong. I see it more in terms of that, like stronger influence and like that. And we're not talking about transits now, but of course, when I think about the slower moving planets in transit, of course, I apply a more narrow orb.
Smaller orb,
Yes.
absolutely.
Yeah, smaller orb with them, but
and
that's
as we
another.
see, so say we've got Pluto, if we go retrograde and if it goes back and forth on a particular angle at those small degrees, it's going to have a profound effect. But yeah, I like what you're saying. Absolutely.
Yeah, but I'm a little bit like I say, for me it's difficult to sometimes say like, okay, this is it, but that's why I like to say it, like if two people are kissing or like that.
And I think natally, for myself, if I'm talking about the lights, the sun or moon, I'll give a Y, but maybe up to 10. But if we're getting, again, the outer planets, certainly tighten those orbs. And again, if we get to transits, progression, solar arcs, the tighter, the better. But I think just for natal, I think you find being a bit more liberal. That's my view anyway.
Yeah, I am. And even because I heard some astrologers talk about this, and you could also bring in the concept of applying versus separating aspects, right? For example, if you want to determine like the strength of an aspect, that's what I do sometimes also. But yeah.
Wonderful.
Yeah, but moving on then, 3 client cases, and I just want to say that these have all given their consent to be in this presentation, and I've informed them about everything and discussed with them prior to this, so they are well informed about me using their charts here, which is important.
Wonderful.
So then we have the first case. Here we have Molly, that I chose to call her. Yes. When I opened up this chart the first time, what I thought was, okay, what came to me was like, okay, potential difficult relationships to the parents. I don't know if you agree with what I sense here, and if you have your interpretation, but this is what I sense. I'm like, okay, potential difficulty with the parents, and I see this. Sometimes I analyze the father using, or I like to say, the father archetype, because it can also be a non-binary. I'm very very modern in that sense, just like the primary caretaker can be a male, doesn't have to be a female, what I mean. But I like to look at, for example, Saturn or the sun, and we can see here, for example, the sun is opposite Pluto, right? We have also the moon in square to Pluto, so these are a little bit more of the challenging aspects here, right? Even though it's a little bit looser, this square. But I still think
and that's still quite profound, because you got that moon, 25 Leo, so it's the applying square to Pluto.
Yes.
Pluto's retrograde, so moving back. So we're applying there by about six degrees or so. So that's quite, that's significant, I would say.
Exactly. And here this was a good example of how we can use our understanding for applying aspects and these kind of things, because if it wasn't applying in that sense, you would say, oh, it's a little bit weaker, but since it is applying, it's a very important point you made there. And I also like to look at the fact that the moon is in the 8th house, because that's also something that I bring into this understanding.
And it's interesting. I do find with clients or anyone who might be looking at particularly the lights in the 8th, wherever that might be, there's again it can be an element of intensity. And I believe is this moon in intercepted sign? So we've got the moon still ruling the 8th there, but it looks like we've got some interception there as well. So again, even pulling more intensity and lack of control, maybe I would say as well, but very interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. And what we see in this client's story is that the parents were struggling with addiction and had a destructive relationship. The home environment was unstable and there was violence in the home. And I'm going to say here, of course, it's very individual. And this is also sometimes why I think it's so important to be open. And if you're an intuitive astrologer, bring in intuition and be ethical and ask the client, because not all people with Mars in the 4th have violence in the home, right? Or Pluto in the 4th or whatever. But it is something that a little bit brings information into this story.
Awareness, and you're seeing that as well. And so Placidus you're using, sorry, is that what you said before?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, yeah, interesting.
And
it is, again, we've got that Mars, and I always look at overall condition. I know it's not really tied to modern astrology, but you got Mars detriment there. It is direct, and then even actually the overall strength of some of these planets, we've got that Jupiter ruling the 4th if we did whole sign, which is in fall. That Saturn is in fall as well. So there's a few issues. That Saturn's the outer set malefic too, and there's for me there's a few issues in this chart. Sorry, I'm waffling on. Carry on.
No, I like this. I like that you bring your I love this, because this is how we create conversation. So yes, and what's interesting also, if we think about also, for example, the moon as nurturing, both to oneself but also to others, and the theme of mothering and feeling safe and the home and all those kind of things. Like the client was put in foster care and she ended up living with a female caregiver who was very dominant, because the parents lost custody, you can say, when the client was 15. So she had to move, and living with a very dominant female. And we can also see this play out here, for example, in the Pluto square to the moon, right? It's also something that we can relate to this. And the school environment was difficult, and the client experienced communication issues, selective mutism. I see this a lot. I don't know if you agree with me, but I see this a lot actually when I find, for example, Saturn in the 3rd house. Because Saturn, according to my practice, creates delays. Yeah. And I see that it often comes with a lot of resistance, struggles, and those kind of things. But of course, with our developmental perspective, the client will or can, overcome these struggles and become much more resilient, mature, and, strong in that sense.
Absolutely. But, and I can relate to this too, because I have Saturn, which is my outer set malefic, in my 3rd house too. And I had a lot of delays, early education, those kind of things, some troubles with school. So I can certainly relate to this. And let's see. So this person, not quite yet, but in the next couple of years will be on their Saturn return as well. So that will be an interesting dynamic when that comes around. So sorry, go.
No, it will be I totally agree. And here's also why I think it's important to inform the client about this and give some hope with Saturn, because like I say, it's really about creating resilience and also somehow learn how to own your experiences. And here we fall back to, again, the Hexaflex, which means that acceptance for the things that you've been through, but then establish values and execute committed action. It's all very Saturnian, if you really think about it, making something tangible or something productive out of things that you experience.
Absolutely. And again, some of the most successful people I've seen have had, in quotes, difficult charts in a sense, and sometimes that friction, creates the diamond. So going through these trials and tribulations, because I mean, what Stephen Forrest says as well, fields of possibilities. So there are skilled versus unskilled manifestations. And again, as you went back to before about not talking in deterministic language, that this is terrible, this is going to work out this way. It's empowering the client that, okay, there might be trials and tribulations, but they can grow as characters through these experiences.
Yeah, it's very, very important. And on that theme also, she expressed certain challenges with, like I said, mothering and feeling emotionally safe in relationship with other women. That was actually something quite challenging for this client. And we can understand that also from what we were saying here. But I mean, let's just, of course, the chart is a whole, but we can choose different focal points and we can try to understand the narrative based on certain placements. And what is interesting here is also that, I mean, a client like this one may think of themselves, if we talk about fusion, you know, with thoughts, they might think of themselves as unlovable, or you know, they could confuse with that thought, I'm unlovable. So it's so very important, like when you approach somebody with such a, I would say, receptive, deep, transformative, potentially a little bit, how can I say, on their guard moon, I would say. It's very important to have this knowledge with you and phrase the questions and what you see in that way, because you know, what we decided to work on with this aspect, for example, is, you know, because the square aspect is difficult, but the way I like to think about it is just like friction, because friction is what creates energy, right? When we move two objects against each other, for example, we get friction, and from there grows energy, just like we make a fire with two sticks you know, against each other. So I spoke with the clients about this, you know, how we can also embrace this depth, because it is a depth, right? It's an emotional depth. And it's also something that the client she can establish certain values, which is like a direction in her life, where it comes to, okay, befriending this depth. Because many times when we talk about the emotional depth, you know, moon in Scorpio, or Pluto in aspect to the moon, or moon in the 8th house, the moon is not safe, right? It's not, doesn't feel safe there. It's not in its safe little cradle. It's more like it's in put in like a really, really deep lake with no bottom. And
Right.
that, yeah, and that depth doesn't have to be bad. You know, there will be experiences that could have been or have been potentially difficult for a person like this. But we have to also nurture, and here comes the word flexibility, create flexibility by opening up, you know, different narrative, different pathways for the client to start thinking about. Okay, but I have an emotional depth. Okay, but how can you express that? How can you nurture that with your moon? And one way for her is, for example, that she used to be very into New Age. Or like she, you know, she got caught up in the New Age wave, which a lot of people do these days. And she just realized that, no, it's not for me. You know, I want to go into the occult practices. I want to go into the depths. And we talked about this, how her Pluto in square to the moon, and moon in the 8th house, is really something that can I can say be favorable for her in terms of exploring depths in that sense.
I love what you spoke to her about that, because I mean, again, a cult, maybe we're taking the 8th. If we take this as a whole sign, it'll put that moon in the 9th as well. So again, those higher philosophy, the 8th, occultism, higher philosophies in the 9th, and again, using that flexibility and exploring those depths of emotions and what they might be. But I think that's a beautiful way of describing that to her. That's fantastic.
Yeah, and also here, before we go to the next one, we also worked a lot with her trine to Uranus, the Sun in trine aspect to Uranus here.
Yep.
Because I have that aspect myself also. And funny enough, her father is an Aquarius, and he's very much rebellious and different. So you can see a little bit if you think about the Sun as her subjective view of the father.
Wonderful.
So we work on that.
I'm talking
also
about ours before, that's quite tight. So we've got the Sun, that's applying. So we've got Uranus retrograde. So that's applying within just over a degree. So that's really quite profound in terms of connection.
And Uranus in the second, if we think about that as value, not only physical material possessions, money, but also the self-worth, right? If we think about the second house there, we can also say that, okay, but there could be uniqueness to your view on your own self-worth, right? Like see your uniqueness also with the trine to the Sun. And that's also a way to, I think, strengthen the fact that this client has been through a lot of, I would say, hardships in her life, communication issues, which, you know, when I met with her, she also told me that she's now at the university, she's pursuing an education, And what do we have here? Yeah, the North Node in Libra in the 9th house. So I was like, yes, very nice, values. Move
Wonderful.
towards educating yourself if you find that interesting. Explore life, explore life's meaning. It's all about that, getting out of those.
And I love how you're exploring options with the client as well. And you go back to communicators. I think we've got a mutual reception there, Mercury, Venus. So tapping in maybe into some of those strengths. I mean, okay, it's a verse and both retrograde, but using that mutual reception, that communicative skill, as you said, going into that North Node of higher education and exploring those possibilities. I think that's a lovely way to tapping into their strengths and empowering the client. That's wonderful.
Yeah, and exactly. And we can also remind the client that ascendant in Sagittarius with Jupiter in the 1st house, it's going to be a lot about you. We can remind them of that and be like, okay, but explore, expand, with Jupiter. We can also boost that energy a little bit also. That's how I like to work, see what challenges and then also see how we can strengthen and see the chart as a whole, of course.
Wonderful, wonderful. Jupiter in cardinal Earth and building maybe a solid foundation, a solid ground for working with the strengths that she's got. Wonderful.
Yeah, and I was even going to say to you because we do have a trine, right, between here Uranus, Chiron, and the Sun, right?
Oh, wonderful, a grand trine. Wonderful, yeah.
I told her, I was like, sometimes I joke also a little bit with my clients. So I said to her, why don't you become an astrologer? Because to some extent you could think about it like that, because she is very interested in astrology. Because Chiron could be linked to astrology in the 9th house, educating oneself, exploring the spiritual realms, and Uranus here we could link in modern astrology to astrology, and the Sun in the 6th house maybe being of service, through the mental expression of the identity. So just give the client different options and then be so clear that it's you that's choosing. It's you. I want to be so clear on that.
It's quite interesting. Do you use secondary progressions? Because I think I looked at this chart beforehand and she will now be coming, I think she'll be at the progressed sun in particular, will be the last degree of Gemini, of mutable air. So that's, I think I was looking on the chart, in the next couple of months, we'll be shifting into cardinal water, into Cancer. So I think it's going to be quite a significant shift for her in the next couple of months as that progressed sun moves into that cardinal water. Very interesting. Sorry, I'm waffling on now. Carry on.
No, like I say, I love the conversation. So just please go on. I like it. It's really nice. But yeah, of course, I use secondary progressions. So I use that like a complementary tool to the natal chart, in addition to transits, of course.
Wonderful.
And sometimes solar return charts as well, actually. But I'm going to stop there with the first client so we don't dig too deep, because I mean, with a chart you can go on and on and on.
I can sit for hours. Sometimes we do labs with students and we're supposed to do it for an hour, but I go on for like 2 or 3 hours. People have to tell me to stop.
Yeah, it's the same. And I also say that to people who come to me or people I talk to, that, even though I have been looking at my chart for quite a lot of years now, I still find new things. And I still get, new thoughts about different aspects or planetary energies in my chart. So it's really something that we cannot get too deep into, I would say.
Absolutely.
But then we have client number 2, Anna. And she moved a lot as a child. She expressed difficulty in regards to feeling rooted. Mother was very hard on her and the father was absent. The school was difficult, dyslexia and ADHD. And she was also given responsibilities at a very young age, and she had to take care of younger siblings and rebelled a lot against that, And also, actually, what I remember is that the mother was very religious, and she changed religion quite often. So this client also struggled a bit with her own, philosophy to, okay, how do I approach life? So, and we can see all this in the chart, right? Because, for example, moving a lot as a child, we could see that with Pluto here, conjunct the IC, because Pluto also plows and transforms, and nothing is like, how do I say, like totally calm with Pluto, right? It's very transformative. So often when I see Pluto conjunct the IC, it's usually something there with the childhood or the mother, because I choose to see the fourth house more linked to the mother or the primary caretaker in that sense. I don't know about you, if you see, some people use the 10th for that. I don't know what you do.
Sorry, what was the question again?
If you look at, for example, the mother, some people say that the mother could be more the 10th house.
I think there's different arguments of where to find the parents, whether it's sun for father, Saturn, moon, Venus for mother, depending sometimes on day charts versus night charts, whatever that might be, and for the fourth. But it's quite interesting you pulled up that Pluto, because that's really quite close in conjunction to the IC. So what we've got Pluto there at 5 degrees retrograde right there on the IC. Interesting, Pluto in Sagittarius, ruled by that Jupiter. That Pisces there, did you say moving a lot? Oh, it's on the screen. So they moved quite a bit as a child. That's quite interesting. Yeah, Pluto, Sagittarius, because if we take that Pluto, that's fourth here in Placidus, and whole sign, that'll be fourth as well. 1, 2, 3, 4. So yeah, Pluto and Sagittarius moving around a lot. That must be quite difficult.
Yeah, it makes sense, right? So and the mother was hard on her, and the fact that I asked her, was your mother religious? I sense that from the fact that her moon here, moon in Virgo in the first house, is opposite Jupiter in Pisces here. So to me, what comes to me intuitively from that aspect is, okay, maybe you had a religious mother. Because that's how I choose to interpret this. I don't know if you agree, but she had a religious mother that changed religion a lot, which impacted her certain ways.
Very interesting. Again, that Jupiter ruling the fourth, the moon there is at a critical degree. So at 29, 37 minutes, a critical degree as well. So maybe, some issues there possibly with the mother, as you're saying. Interesting.
Yeah, and also we had the father was absent. Then we can look at the sun for the father, for example. Like I say, I use both Saturn and the sun for the father.
So you got their sun rule in the 12th. I think whole sign as well. That sun would be in the 12th. So absent father. I've seen that in quite a few charts. I mean, again, it's not cut and dry for finding parents in the chart. But I do find sometimes if seeing clients or I pull up other charts, particularly the sun in the 12th or rule in the 12th, sometimes issues of absent fathers, whether sometimes it's a sun, Pluto square, whatever it might be. But again, pulling up themes and building a story, that kind of makes sense.
Yeah, and what I sense also here is the sun opposite Neptune.
Yeah, absolutely.
I sense that because the father was also struggling a lot with addiction.
Wow. Okay. Wow.
So he was absent also due to that, So we see that also portrayed here in the chart, and which also
that's quite especially for a child, like finding your own, because the sun, finding your own identity. I mean, we can pull in. I think you pull in the father there as well, but is it a she? Sorry.
Yeah.
Her own sense of identity to that fairly close Sun Neptune opposition. That maybe that confusion. If you moved around a lot as a child, finding those sense of roots. That Pluto on the IC, and again the Neptune Sun opposition, and what is my identity? I've moved around so much. What is my, who am I? I mean, look, I think luckily that the Sun is so strong. Is domicile is up there in a day chart, diurnal. They say Sun Leo, wonderful, but with the some issues with self-identity as well as the father.
Yes, and exactly, I agree with you, because what happened with this client, because of these themes, and also the fact that she has a moon in at a critical degree, of course, but in Virgo, and you see also the square here from Saturn. It's a square between Saturn and the sun. There was a lot of self-criticism and conditional love, and also the theme of, like I mentioned, to take care of the siblings, for example, and to be like herself, the kind of parent figure, I would say. So the Saturn square here to the sun, I mean, it has been very difficult for this client, I would say, because Saturn in the 9th, speaking about delays also, it sort of also created a lack of meaning in life, because, I think since the childhood was traumatic and all of that, and, she rebelled also, but, she had to take care of the children, and here we have always the theme of, I would say, struggling with the concept of good enough, right? With the Virgo moon.
And again, like any of these planets with the lights, outer planets, or Saturn, as you said here in particular, that the Sun Saturn square, a loose, T square, Sun, Neptune, Saturn. So that restriction, not only confusion in terms of in terms of identity, excuse me, but also that you said she was responsible for her siblings a lot of the time and all those kind of things. Very interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, it was a lot of those themes. And like I say, the criticism was so evident. And that's why I also say that here we work with several of these themes in the Hexaflex, because we have to create a diffusion between the thoughts, the self-criticism, in order to start moving towards other values and apply also self-compassion, because that's something that can be difficult with Saturn in square to the Sun while having like a Virgo moon, which is also a lot, many times about productivity or, being of service, being good,
Yeah.
so it's a lot of those themes. And I just wanted to also mention how here with Chiron, because just as with Saturn in the third house, I also tend to see the same kind of themes oftentimes with Chiron in the third house, or Chiron in Gemini, if you look more in generations. And Chiron in the third house, like I mentioned, she was diagnosed with dyslexia. School was so difficult. She was struggling there. I would just say it was very difficult.
Responsibility for the siblings as well. Did that weigh heavily
exactly.
on her against Saturn? Sun, in there. Let's see. So we've got that Venus rule in there, but whether it's whole sign, whether that's that Mars in fall conjunct that Venus, or Venus ruling the third there. Again, have we got another interception? But some of those difficult themes that you can see again as you build in that story is really quite interesting in this particular one.
And what is so important to work with a client like this, according to me, is just values. Because, I say to people, for example, with hard aspects from Saturn, with like a Virgo moon, I'm like, okay, but your 100% is probably, my 150%. You know what I mean by that? Like, these people could have very high, how can I say, like demands for themselves. Like, I should do this, I should be good. And that conditional love that she may have experienced, from the mother archetype, mother in that sense, she has like internalized that to some extent. And there we have the self-criticism. So to try to work with those themes and be like, okay, but values, they're different than goals, they're often confused, but a goal is more finite in that sense. Like, it's an end, I made it or I didn't make it. And then we have like values, which is like one day you can take 3 steps in that direction, another day you might take 1 step, another day you might stand still, but you apply the self-compassion to yourself, have that sort of allowing perspective. It's so super important, I think, with these clients, because we have to remind them also of time with Saturn, that time will pass. And I almost say to these people that you will almost like age backwards a little bit because you were like Benjamin Button, with Saturn in contact to the Sun, because you had a lot of responsibilities on your back when you were younger. But, as time goes with Saturn, we get more wisdom, we do learn more, we have more resilience, we have more acceptance, just like with Chiron, that we know how to integrate and make use of our potential, I would say, shortcomings. It's so important to have that hopeful perspective with a client like this. And she was even thinking about, since she has like kind of also the, I would say, the ascendant ruler is in the 12th house, right? And the North Node is also in the 12th house. So from my point of view, you can also say, okay, but spiritual pursuits here, the creative spiritual pursuits could be quite important for you in that sense. And also the very transformative energy here with a trine from Pluto to the Sun. We can really work with that. And she actually wants to become like a shaman, one day.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Again, empowering, find that power, that Sun applying to that Pluto, very quite close, and find that empowerment. And you talked about before a bit about self-care. So we've got that moon there. I noticed you've using Ceres there. So the asteroids you're bringing in conjunct the midheaven, got that partile trine to the moon, which, so bringing in some of these skills, some of these behavior, going into that spiritual realm, and again, self-care, empowering, and giving them the tools, or at least exploring the options that you've talked about before, about letting them, choose their path that's going to help them on their journey. That's wonderful.
Yeah, and exactly. And like also the ruler of the MC is also in the 12th, right?
Wow.
So
Absolutely.
she
Yeah.
could work a lot with some self-undoing or like, how can I say, charity or giving in that sense. But very important then, if she decides to do that kind of work, we talked about this as well. It's very important to be aware of this Neptune opposition to the sun, for example, and the moon in Virgo in the first house, because it's important to also have boundaries, like where do my responsibilities end and where, where do I take care of myself? So establish
Absolutely.
that very firmly is important.
You got Uranus there. Uranus there at 11. So for what, about six degrees? That's quite interesting as well. I think in the next few years. So let's see. Where's Pluto now? We just gone retrograde 0 degrees. Are we at 1 degree still? So in the next few years, when that Pluto transits across, it's going to hit the opposition to the Sun, and then hit the former T square with that Saturn too. So that's going to be a time, as you said, using the language to be maybe a transformative time to hone her powers. That Pluto, I think it. No, because Pluto's going to dip back into Capricorn, but as we go through in the next 2 or 3 years, as that Pluto transits, hits the Sun, hits the T square with Saturn, maybe building that, finding that inner power. And again, so again, I'm waffling on, but that's what's.
I like it. I like it. And just lastly, also what you mentioned, but also the shaman kind of thing that she was interested in. It would also be a great way to actually embody I would say, a developed energy of Pluto conjunct the IC, because it could be to extract, power and regenerate yourself by connecting to, the roots and ancestors also. Because in the shamanic tradition, you can also go backwards, and it can be very tied to your culture, right?
Yeah.
So it's also could be a way to really find that intimacy to your roots and your deeper cultural ancestors, I would say.
I love that.
That's what we talked about with Pluto also. So because some people get so scared when they see Pluto in the 4th house, specifically people that have kids, they're like, oh my God, my child is born with Pluto now conjunct IC. And I try to say, listen, there are different expressions, right? It doesn't have to
many
be
fields of possibility. Absolutely. And I think was this the case? This lady is she the one who moved a lot as a child? Is this the one? Yeah. So it's quite interesting. I'm just looking at some of the mutable signs. We've got a mutable ascendant, a mutable midheaven. So we've got Moon, we'll say Pluto, Moon, Jupiter. So we've got mutability here. So I think using that, maybe those times of moving around a lot and having to adapt into different environments may become a skill as she works, again, if she works in a spiritual sense, working with different people in different environments, and using that adaptability to her advantage is one of the things that comes to mind for me, and that would be quite interesting to see.
I agree with that. Yeah, but we're going to move on to the last chart, which I call Mary.
Okay.
Here also, immediately when I pulled this chart up, I was like, oh, childhood. It comes to me immediately because I guess you maybe also sensed this. But usually when I see a little bit more challenging childhoods, this is like.
Oh wow, another Pluto on there on the IC. Sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
Another Pluto there, and Pluto on the IC, for example, Pluto in square here, right, to the moon. Chiron conjunct the moon, Mars conjunct the moon. We have, no, let's go backwards one step. Let's see, there we are. And then we also have Saturn, right, in square to the sun. So we have a little bit of everything here. Even though it's a 6-degree orb, but still, it's valid for me.
Yeah, absolutely.
So here we have a client who had a very tight relationship with her mother, but and here it's also so important to let the client speak, let the client own her own story, because my view on this could be like, oh, traumatic childhood. But I don't say that, of course, because that is not how we can, let the client be empowered. Instead, I bring up themes of intensity. I bring up themes of, okay, but the childhood could have been quite transformative to some extent. How do you relate to that? And
again, the language you're using, I love the way you're using language. Again, not to be too definitive or bring up, triggered keywords that might be emotive, to other people. You're actually lending the open questions to that, still addressing the issues that may be there, but getting the client to maybe to talk about those. Yeah, I think that's
But it's actually, like I said, it's quite challenging sometimes. I think also, specifically if you're, I would say, more new in astrology, because then you're so eager to show that, oh, I can see this, you're so eager to let people know, like, oh my God, I can see this about you. But it's really there. We have to like take a step back and be like, okay, is this about me or is this about the client? And it is about the client. And that's why I say, even though we can see things, we have to.
And of course, we speak the language, astrology is, and if we're working with clients, some of people I work with that'll know, certain, basic things about astrology. But again, you're not speaking in that language. You're speaking in terms of addressing maybe the themes or talking about it, not just spewing out, oh, you've got Pluto conjunct the IC square, T square, all those kind of things is not going to be useful in a consultation setting.
No, definitely not. So it's so important. But yeah, she did say that the relationship was not at all problem-free. And then when we scratched the surface also, and like I say, here we also have Pluto in square to the moon. So we have to get closer to these clients with a little bit of caution, I would say, or like we have to nurture them in a way so that they can maintain their privacy also, right? With Pluto in aspect to the moon. So when we scratch the surface there, she describes that there was psychological and physical abuse during childhood, with an absent father and a very pressured mother who struggled to make a living. And the interesting thing here is that, okay, we can see here, right? Mars close to the moon could mean a whole different, range of things, but it could also be that this can symbolize what she talks about with physical abuse during childhood, right? And that it came also from the mother, and the mother was very strained, for example, worked a lot. And
for me, it's the same theme in terms of house systems. So even whole sign as well as Placidus, we've got that Mars rule in the 4th, Pluto conjunct the IC in the 12th in this chart. So it's the outer set malefic, moon conjunct the outer set malefic as well, which is compounded and then compounded by that Chiron as well. So that's quite interesting. So again, you won't come out and say, oh, were you abused or do you have trauma as a child, letting them, speak to maybe themes that come up. But sorry for interrupting. I'm just, again,
no, please continue to interrupt. I like it, like I say. But what is important to just say quickly about the moon is that we have to always remember here with the moon that the moon is subjective, right? It's not like the sun, this conscious luminary in that sense. It's not a conscious energy in that sense. It's like the emotionality, but it's like the subjective reality. So this is why also, of course, like children with the same mother, they have oftentimes different moon signs because it's their subjective understanding of their mother. It's not how the mother is objectively, right? It's so important that I say this because otherwise I could also make something, I could also be potentially a little bit unethical if I stomp in here and I say, oh, but your mother was aggressive. I can see that. Because that would be taking the objective role. But here is really about what is the subjective experience, because that is the moon, right? The subjective.
Absolutely. And again, you're making that distinction between the sun, the consciousness, the light versus the moon, which is, I ask people if they're tapping into their moon, what makes you feel safe or comfortable? If you're having a really bad day and you're pissed off, what do you do when you go home? So do you go and make a nice cake, or do you go back and do you read a whole bunch of books? Depending on the modality and the element of the moon, like where does this person feel comfortable? So I might ask that question as well. So we've got moon fixed fire. I might ask this person, what makes you feel comfortable when you're not feeling safe, or to make yourself feel safe rather. Those kind of questions to lead in. What makes them feel at home? I get the unconscious as well, where they maybe not, putting that out there. Yeah.
Yeah. And what is interesting here, because I tend to see this quite a lot also with moon in the 12th. I don't know about you, because you use whole sign, if I understand correctly. But
I use both. So planetary strength, Placidus, maybe Coke, a few other quadrant house systems, but I'll use a whole sign as well, like a fusion, just fusion. A lot of as we said before the recording, house systems can be a contentious issue, but I find it's more effective to look at a chart in multiple systems, and you can glean information, I think, from many different systems, and depending what you're using the astrology for as well. So
Exactly, I agree. But many times when I see the moon in the 12th house, it's often to me, of course, this person is very receptive, intuitively, emotionally. It's like, it's almost like a sponge. I mean, you can say that the moon is a sponge for everybody, right? But for this person, I say like it's a sponge that soaks up a lot from beneath the surface, or it's like from everything around us with the moon in the 12th. And this is exactly what happened also during childhood, because the client, she suppressed her own emotional expressions and her own needs in order to nurture her mother, you know, to kind of like I would say fend off these physical outbursts, or you know, the fact that the mother was struggling so much and the father was absent, and these kind of things. Like she became really, speaking of Chiron also in conjunction to the moon, she really became, you know, this healing force for the mother. But in that process, she neglected herself, and I see this, like I say, a lot with the moon.
Essentially, her nurturing was really her self undoing there in the 12th, of being maybe overly or trying to fix other people, fix the mother, and again being that self undoing is not neglecting her own maybe emotional needs or what she needs. So maybe to tune into again what makes her feel safe, what makes her feel emotionally fulfilled in her own life.
Yeah, exactly. And interestingly also, if you think about the moon, which could also be, I mean, she described difficulties with food, knowing when she's full versus hungry. This could also sometimes be linked to the moon in terms of how I interpret it, because like the moon is nurturing, right? So it's also you can also link it to the moon in terms of self-care, right? Caring for yourself. And I also think about Cancer, which is ruled by the moon, and the stomach, you know, all those kind of things.
And she has a first quarter moon, so that moon is building in light as well, so expanding those things. Yeah, interesting.
And also on that theme, we also have the Venus-Neptune square, right?
Oh yeah, exact. Yeah, yeah.
So which is quite exact here. So we see these themes. That's why I also like astrology, because it's about pattern recognition. You see a little bit here, a little bit there, a little, like it's you can see the same narrative, the same story.
And you're synthesizing the information and building a story. But yeah, that Venus, I mean, not in particularly great shape. You know, cadent fall. Detriment for in cadent house as well. But yeah, tightly square the Uranus Neptune. Again, just building another piece of that puzzle there. Interestingly.
So what we did here with this client, you know, because she expressed so much guilt and self-criticism, and I tied that a lot to this Saturn square to the sun, for example, and also moon in the 12th and Pluto square to the moon, like a lot of different things here. But guilt and self-criticism for not taking enough care of her mother, because her mother had also recently passed away, and she lived in another country. So she was like, again, you know, moon in the 12th, the mother was like absent in that sense.
Right.
She could not care as much as she wanted. And I mean, she did face a lot of responsibilities as a young child, which we see here with the Saturn square, just like we had the other client with the Saturn square to the sun. She did that as well.
Wow.
So we worked a lot here with the concept of, you know, with a Leo moon in the 12th house. And we also have a trine to Venus here, for example. You know, I think about creativity a lot for her. That's what came to me, because also if you neglected your own emotionality as a child in order to please, for example, your parent, then maybe when you become a parent, in order to not reproduce those patterns to your own children, you might have to then take a look and be like, okay, but how do I nurture myself? You know, it's a very, very important theme here. And so we worked a lot with the words, you know, childish versus childlike. And there's a great distinction here between those two words, because when the self-criticism came into the mix, you know, because she liked to paint and she also loves to write, which we can see here with the moon sextiling her Mercury in Gemini.
Wonderfully strong Mercury as well. Yeah, angular domicile, beautiful.
She loves to write, and But when she wrote something, she could become so self-conscious and start to criticize herself, so she just stopped. And we spoke about this. Okay, but let's try to diffuse from those thoughts. Now we're back at the Hexaflex again, and implement this, like, okay, but take a flexible approach here. Okay, what your Saturn square sun might say is childish, because that's something that Saturn could say, right?
Right.
Childish to do this, because it doesn't have any, real implication or real meaning that you're drawing or writing this. And then we bring in the world of childlike, because that nurtures her Leo moon in the 12th house, and really work here with like writing about her emotional experiences as a child. Like, that is something that can also, considering the fact that she does have Pluto, so there's a lot of depth here, and there is creativity, there is healing, right? And the sextile to Mercury, we really try to bring that in as something that she can do as a committed action in terms of self-compassion.
I love, again, just tapping into your client's strengths, and you're noticing that again how strong that Mercury is, the sextile, like elementary. I love this chart. So again, you bring in that fire, where it's the fixed fire, the cardinal fire. You got the elements working well there, the mutable air. So again, that self-expression, that joy, putting it out there, and maybe emotionally expressing herself through writing. And I think, again, tapping into these potential strengths is so wonderful to outlay to the client. Wonderful, yeah.
Yeah, and she had a lot of questions right now also, because if you see also the chart, MC is in Taurus, 21 degrees of Taurus. So Uranus is currently transiting up there.
So that'll be going over. And she just recently had a Saturn return as well.
Yeah.
So that's quite wow. So there's going to be a lot going on there. So we've got the Saturn return coming back. So I think Saturn will go back to 0 degrees when it retrogrades. I don't know if he'll hit the 0 degrees 10, but I'll certainly go back to. Sorry, I'm waffling on again. So yeah, that Saturn return. You got the Uranus. Where we are Uranus? Are we at 18 degrees or so? 18, 19?
Yeah, sorry. Yes, exactly. Somewhere there, I think, because it's right now, it's conjunct my Mercury in Taurus, so I'm electrified in my brains.
Oh yeah. So we're going to retrograde and go back over, but eventually go back again over that 21 degrees. So very
so
interesting.
She was thinking a lot about, should I leave my safe career, because she works in the government sector, of course, like Taurus, midheaven, stable career, but she was thinking about, okay, but I would like to pursue something more creative and do something more with my writing. And like with this person also, since we have an ascendant in Leo and the sun ruling the ascendant in the 10th house, the public role, the public persona, the legacy is going to be quite important during her lifetime. So I really wanted to also highlight that to her, and also highlight here in terms of making something out of her experiences in terms of writing or creating, that can also help her here with the North Node in the 4th house in terms of creating more of an emotional security, a base, a sense of home for herself, whether that be in physical form or just internally. But that can also lay the groundwork for her when she becomes a parent, perhaps herself, to not, like I say, reproduce the experiences that she had to go through.
Again, I love how you're exploring these options. So we've got that Uranus going over the midheaven. What a time to start something new career-wise. And you said you've got the chart rule of the sun, angular 10th right there, and the Mercury rule in the 2nd house. So using that creative ability maybe to earn income that way. Again, it's just a potential of the natal chart if you're taking other things into consideration. But I love, again, how you're exploring with these options. I think is wonderful. I got a quick question, actually. So I noticed her ascendant at 29:57. Is her birth time accurate to the minute? Because any minutes beyond that, that's going to shift quite a bit, I think.
Well, yeah, exactly. I have asked her several times, and every time, she says it's accurate.
So yeah. I was just wondering, because that's so close.
Yeah, it's extremely
57
close.
minutes.
Yeah, it's extremely close. And I guess I'm not typically interpreting so much about degrees, but I know some astrologers would also see this as I would say impactful, very impactful when the ascendant is so much at a very, very last degree.
But interestingly, I think for this chart anyway, we've got, even if it's got the Leo rising, which said it is with the Sun rule in Gemini 10th. I mean, even if it was a Virgo ascendant, Mercury up there 10th, mutable air anyway. Yeah. So it's still, for me, it's still speaking about the same themes that you've been talking about.
Yeah, and you know, that is also what is interesting, because you say you also use different house systems sometimes, right?
Right.
And it's interesting because you can use different house systems and you can still retrieve information that is valuable, according to me. It's the same, I say, if you would use astrology and then you pair it sometimes with like a tarot deck or whatever. You know, I've tried this myself also, even though I'm a beginner with tarot, but you know, I pull cards and they align with what I see in the horoscope, and that's why I really like to bring in the whole intuitive aspect, or like, you know, the esoteric, a little bit like what lies beyond the comprehensible in that sense, because to some extent we will retrieve the information, we will get the information, and it's just like I say, the house system is just like, do you want to use an oracle deck or do you want to use a tarot deck? If you ask me, you can still get information.
It was like from the beginning of your presentation when you were talking about, because I was thinking about Bernadette Brady, Eagle and the Lark. I don't know if you've read that book, but the eagle being the, you know, the techniques, the astrology that we learn. Again, that element of intuition, the lark, to make that leap, to make that intuitive leap, because obviously you have an academic background as well, but you're also incorporating and blending in this intuitive ability, which I think is absolutely wonderful, and combining the two. And yeah, it's absolutely fantastic.
Yeah, the only thing with bringing in the intuition, what I've noticed is sometimes I forget to talk about the sun because you know, yeah, because to me, you know, the sun is so important, of course, but you know, that's usually the part that people know the most about. So when I look at the chart intuitively, I don't really have like a structure approach in that sense. Okay, where do I begin? I'm more like, I'm opening up the chart and then I'm like, okay, what is happening here? I let myself be guided by intuition. And that's why I say sometimes I can have like a consultation, and in the end I'm like, oh, and by the way, yeah, your sun is in Gemini in the 10th house, you know, because to me there's so much more, you know. It's like, yeah, I look at the
again, all the information again, and again, synthesizing all the information and putting the pieces together. And again, it's telling a story, telling a narrative. It's not, again, as we've said before, the deterministic, you know, when we go back to the fate versus free will, but trying to build a story. And again, is it going to be skilled or unskilled? That's empowering the client to make the decisions for themselves in that sense. Interestingly, I just, again, intuitively, all these chart examples that you've brought up, they all seem to have like a splash pattern. So a lot of the energies seem to be put in all different parts of the chart. So you don't have ones like a bowl where it's quite contained. So I just thought that was quite interesting how a lot of these splash patterns are coming through these different clients. And for me, in splash patterns, it's either, you know, they're either the energies scattered in so many different areas of life, or it's quite a universal theme as well. So I just thought that was quite interesting in terms of the clients you chose today.
Yeah, and I think also, I guess we will come to that in the end. That was the last chart example I had, by the way. But if we come to this, you know, I don't know if we are ready to go there, but should I let that slide come on about my practice, or do you want to ask something before I move on to that?
Oh, no, this is wonderful. No, yeah.
I think we have... I mean, I think I have demonstrated a little bit how I work with the charts, and
oh, absolutely, yeah, absolutely wonderful.
Yeah, because you know, I think that the fact that I also brought these client examples because they can resonate also with my chart to some extent, and I think that sometimes what happens when we meet clients or, you know, work with consultations, because the client charts that I chose, they all have somehow, you know, moon in the 8th, Pluto in square to the moon or something like that. And you know, I am born myself with a Scorpio moon, and I have a loose conjunction with Pluto to my moon.
Ah, wow.
I'm a sun in Taurus, moon in Scorpio, and ascendant in Sagittarius. So I think that's also why I say that I don't want to tell clients what to do. I want to nurture their own agency, because you see my big three here: Sun in Taurus, Moon in Scorpio. Like, it's a lot of fixed energy.
Absolutely.
I don't like when somebody tells me what I should do. So, you know, I like to
But
apply
I love how you're
this.
incorporating that as well. So, for example, my big three, I'm Aquarian Sun, Gemini Moon, Libra Rising. So it's a lot of air. But again, I think air can be, you know, to delineate and to, again, give people options. And maybe I'm less I find it difficult to feel emotions, but I can talk about them. You know, it's those kind of feel. But we're working with a client. I don't want to come off as too detached. So I try and zone in into their Mercury, into their Moon, and to discuss it like that. Yeah. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does make sense. And you know, that's why I think I get people, like I say, that have these Hades moons or whatever you call them, you know, when Pluto is in the mix, or Scorpio placements, transformative experiences, because I have a Scorpio moon. So and you know, I befriended my Scorpio moon, so I'm not scared of the dark anymore.
Absolutely. And again, that fixed water, that energy and the depth is so incredible. And again, from a psychological point of view, getting in depth and getting under the surface of other people as well. I mean, for me, that just speaks to a lot of Scorpio moon people that I know, which is a beautiful skill to have.
Yeah, you know, it's not strange that I became a psychologist, because my MC is in Scorpio and Pluto is conjunct my MC, and my moon is in the 10th house. So yeah, I tend to like psychology and going into the deeper sides of life.
Wonderful.
But yeah, I call myself a modern intuitive astrologer with 1 foot in science and 1 foot beyond. So that's basically what I do. And yeah, here are also some links to where to follow me on social media.
Wonderful. So what we've got, Instagram, that's your email there, website, esotericadventures.com. Wonderful. Child of the Night Astrology Podcast. Fantastic. And what we'll do for everybody watching, I'll put all the links below this video in the description as well, so you can go and meet Frida and again follow on all these different platforms and send emails or visit websites as you might like to do, and put those there. Thank you so much, Frida, for joining us today. Absolutely fascinating chart examples to share with us. And again, I love doing this, that we're using real life examples, and I know you've had permission and to use these. And again, we can bring in celebrity charts and stuff like that, but actually working with the clients that you've worked with, it gives so much light, and I'm so happy they agreed to share their charts and their examples. But again, what a wonderful approach. And I really do appreciate the ethical points that you're bringing into this presentation, because it's so important, these, again, ethical considerations. And again, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much. Lovely to talk to you.
Wonderful. Thank you all for watching. Goodbye.